great expectations for this session as well. And without any further delay, I proceed to the first speaker, who is Professor Peter Dabrock, who's going to see the issue of genome editing from the Protestant perspective. Professor Dabrock, he's a professor in the Friedrich-Alexander University of Erlangen. He studied Protestant and Catholic theology, philosophy and social sciences in Würzburg, Bonn and Bochum in Germany. And after a vicarship at the Protestant church in Holzwickede, Germany, and several positions in academia as researcher, assistant, associate and full professor in Bochum and Marburg, now has been chair of systematic theology at the above-mentioned university. In 2011, he became ordained minister of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bavaria. Beyond serving in many high-level national and international advisory bodies in academia, church and society, including the European Group of Ethics, he has been an appointed member of the German Ethics Council since 2011. Since 2016, has been its elected chairperson. Professor Dabrock has published several books and more than 200 articles with special focus on ethics of life sciences, of technology, of social justice, and of sexual ethics. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you to the organizers for having invited me and giving me the opportunity to present in close to 30 minutes my approach of Protestant ethics on this topic of genome editing in particular and emerging biotechnologies in general. So I was not so sure about the expectations of the organizers with regard to my talk. So I tried to predict something like in genome editing, our topic, and I thought that Robin would perhaps already have addressed some of the moral problems and not only the technical and biological issues. And lucky me, it was a correct prediction. So I decided, on the one hand, to introduce and make you more familiar, if you are not, with the current state of the art of the general debate on CRISPR-Cas ethics, because, and I follow this line, as theological ethics very often have the feature of speaking in a very peculiar manner on topics and give to people who are not familiar with a special topic the feeling that they could reinvent the wheel. And not only in terms of fairness to all the other ethicists in the field, but also with regard to my theological approach, which I will introduce later, I think we should shift away from this kind of behavior and look for a common debate on these topics. And this is exactly how I try to manage with these topics when serving in these different groups where your theological background mostly only indirectly is of relevance, but as far as I hope to demonstrate, it is of relevance. So let's get started. So this part I can skip, as we had these two fantastic talks by Robin about the content of the topic of CRISPR-Cas. But ethics comes into question if people, if the general public, and also scientists by themselves have the impression that they lose orientation, their standard kind of orientation as they are familiar in that field. And if a technology is widely regarded as a disruptor, then it is, one could say a priori, clear or evident that such a new emerging technology, biotechnology, is in need of not only ethical advice, but also of societal deliberation. And here, just for the minutes, the possible fields of application where we have learned much more this morning about the chances, the risk, the weaknesses, but also the opportunities in that field. And the fascinating issue is that CRISPR is a tool which can be applied to all different kind of genetic technology. And in each of these fields, you could address very different challenges, but we have also some challenges in common. We just did not address the gene drive issue, for example, this morning. That would be another issue, but we, as far as I learn, are mostly interested in the application towards the human being. So when I now want to address ethical questions and ethical consideration on genome editing, I must admit, and I want to make this taken for granted assumption clear and evident, that I'm convinced that beside some very single issues, ethical reflection, which is not just to be identified with moral intuitions, should avoid, on the one hand, from a kind of ethics which I call with the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann protest communication. Protest communication means you are against everything. And you just say no, no, and that gives you attention in the general public, because in every talk show you need someone who is against it. And so this is, of course, an interesting expectation for ethicists to run in this direction, because it gives you media attention. So, but I think ethics should avoid from this kind of communication, as avoiding from just serving as what I call acceptance raising. This is usually when ethicists work within a company. So they have the duty to make the product ethically smart, and in that way to be able to sell it better. So find a happy medium between these two poles, on the one hand of no protest communication and no accepting raising, and the far-reaching idea of ethics in this understanding, to my mind, is enabling a responsible political decision-making. And having this in mind, now I want to make you familiar that beside the mentioned report of the National Academies in America, also in September 2016, the National Council on Bioethics published a first report on, they called an ethical review on genome editing, and they are now intensively working on a thorough and comprehensive report on the topic. And the interesting fact about that ethical review was that they differentiated different kind of applications of genome editing according to their different urgencies. And they came to the conclusion that the urgent topics in application of genome editing would be human reproduction, livestock. In the near future, we could and should expect gene drive for disease vectors and xenotransplantation, and in the distant futures, more science fiction than science facts, user-based therapies, precision breeding, changing cultural perceptions. I'm not fully, I do not fully agree with these predictions, but personally I must admit, and in former slides I have produced, I had an alternative prioritization, but learned from the publications of the Portland group that the scientific progress is running so fast that one should be very hesitant about predictions in that field. So, nevertheless, we should have raise awareness to all of these different kinds, as I mentioned, as many of them could immediately, unexpectedly meet a point, a surprising point in the scientific process, and therefore I think we need ethics, and all of us are familiar with the fact that the discipline of ethics is not an invention of Christian theology, but it belongs to the Greek heritage of our own tradition. And in ethics, we do not primarily say what is wrong and what is right, but we look for the criteria of the justification of what is wrong, what is right, what is good, and what is evil. And there we have different approaches like the teleological approach, the deontological approach, and the consequentialistic approach. And of course, it's mostly easy to primarily follow, as you did, the consequentialistic approach, because the prerequisites for this approach are not as thick as the prerequisites of the other approaches are. And therefore, especially in an international debate, also me as someone taking part in these debates primarily looks for consequentialist pro or con arguments. And then, well, I'm convinced that this is not enough, because I'm convinced that also those who are in favor of a primarily consequentialistic approach have their own worldviews, their own taken for granted assumptions, and we also have to address these different questions. And we would lose a lot if we do not address these questions. So, and I run through these elements, but just want to have them within my entire approach. These ethical criteria within an approach of wide reflective equilibrium should be in a mostly coherent way combined with moral attitudes, with the seriously taken of what I call facts, and also look for just procedures and good governance, because ethics in our times is not deconnected from the given juridical and regulated framework, but have to take this into account as also, especially when it comes to these questions, ethics does not invent the wheel. There are many regulations, and we have to consider our own ideas against this background. Otherwise, it would be as I would call it, undercomplex. So, and these ethical criteria, as I mentioned, meet preferentially different moral objects like the individuum, the person, the environment, the community, and the society. And with regard to these different objects which are, of course, nevertheless interconnected, some of these criteria get into a predominant function, like, first of all, of course, dignity, but when it comes to environment, animal rights, sustainability, diversity, interconnectedness, or when it comes to community, question of justice, solidarity, common good, and social cohesion. So these are all questions we must have in mind when we address one of these applications of genome editing. And this I will skip and just run to this, which I think important issue, which the ethical community has had learned within the last, let's say, 15 years when coping with the questions of emerging biotechnologies. It is not enough to deal with these questions in a way what in former times was called the deficit model, in a way that science informs the general public, and then the general public accepts the information of the scientific community, and everything goes ahead in the way as the scientific community wants it. That is the first wave of bioethics called, it was so-called downstream, often reactive, followed classical principle, and was close to paternalistic approach. The dialectical opposition, of course, was then integrate as much as possible opinions within the general public, look upstream, prospective, and build an awareness of the general public. You could call that close to the communicational approach of ethics of Jürgen Habermas, for example. But especially when it comes to the last 2-3 years, and I just name the two or the buzzwords of fake news and filter bubbles and echo chambers, we all become more and more aware that this romantic understanding of the public also runs short. And we have to address these special problems which arise from this new kind of blurred forms of publicity. And this third way of ethics I would like to address later. So having all this in mind, I just wanted to give you a flavor. Then comes to a grid of ethical considerations which you should take into account when you try to cope with these questions of emerging biotechnologies in general and genome editing in particular. And I just roughly presented it to you in order to give a feeling that ethics is a complex business. It is not enough just to have 1, 2, 3 principles, say, well, I'm against playing God, and therefore I condemn most of your research, for example. Yeah? This is what one often can find also from some civil society organizations, and sometimes also from some representatives of our churches. And this was one of the reasons why I just wanted to give you a feeling how complex it is. And then I just want to focus your attention, draw your attention to the questions which were addressed partly this morning, that you then have to address the one could say, old-fashioned problems of biosafety, biosecurity, deprofessionalization, and risk assessment, as we have learned in the consequentialistic approach this morning. And you have to also address the different areas of genome editing, and they have in mind the level of innovation, the level of intrusion, the level and mode of regulation, and societal and cultural uneasy, which mostly is addressed in the metaphorical way, as you mentioned, Ulrich, is with the playing God or the Frankenstein or the Pandora's box attitude. So, once again, just for the minutes, in the pan-European, especially European Union framework, the approach of responsible research and innovation tries to address this complex understanding of ethics, this complex way of integrating these so-called three waves of bioethics in a way which in general I do appreciate, but the toolbox of responsible research and innovation is at its best a necessary but not a sufficient device for dealing with these questions. And of course we cannot, and especially as theologians, as churches, refrain from making clear and evident our own position within these topics. And if we, by presenting and putting forward our own position, we also can contribute to the, as I call it, the $1 million or $1 billion question. How could we develop sustainable trust regimes, and how to build trust in institutions within that field of genome editing? Then we perhaps had the perfect solution. I'm not convinced that we will find the perfect solution, but I'm still not optimistic, but I feel challenged to contribute to the societal embeddedness of research in that field, as I am convinced it is a disruptor. It is a disruptor beyond the scientific community. It will have an impact on all of our lives. I made the phrase 2 years ago that the life that our children will live in the CRISPR world, and therefore we have to look for our special criteria, for our criteria of responsibility. And this is now, I want to focus the last minutes on, as I thought it might be of interest when we hear within the community of European churches also have an ecumenical exchange of thoughts of our different approaches on issues like bioethics. It might be helpful to reflect on one's own theological, in my case, my Protestant background. And here are, let's say, the features of my Protestant theological approach, which I now afterwards would not immediately want to apply to the question of emerging biotechnologies in general and genome editing in particular, but will have two intermediate steps in a way that I introduce the, to my mind, most important Protestant differentiation between the ultimate and the penultimate, introduced by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and picking up the old doctrine of the two spheres of the two reigns of God, and combining it with the theological phenomenology of sin introduced by Karl Barth. And this combination then I will apply to our question. So please give me some minutes following my train of thoughts to come to these conclusions. So the general approach I call concrete ethics, which means I try to avoid the terms of applied ethics or ethics of a special sphere, but here I introduce my Hegelian heritage, and I'm also convinced that we cannot beam us back to ancient times, but we are modern, we live in modern times and have to apply our own traditions to the fact that we live in modern times with modern history of science and society and democracy and human rights. So I'm in favor of an ethics of responsibility, which means shaping a responsible communicative identity and look for what I call bilinguality, which is rooted on the one hand in scripture and prepared to proactively shape modern society. And this governing differentiation, which I named, I would like to apply or give predominance to all other theological topics like creation, for example. So I look to creation through the lenses of reconciliation, of the gospel of reconciliation and justification. So, and now I come to the governing differentiation introduced by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He differentiates, and it's on the one hand very easy differentiation, on the other hand differentiation which produces a huge amount of consequences between the ultimate and the penultimate. And the differentiation is insofar very easy that the ultimate is only understood as the gospel of the reconciliation of the world and the justification of man by grace and by faith alone. That's typical Protestant, I know. And the penultimate is all the other stuff. That's very easy. And why, nevertheless, this simple differentiation, why is it useful for application in many fields of our life? Because it gives you a sensitivity for communication, for work, for decisions which do not recognize given limits. So it gives you a tool of sensitivity for not accepting limits in a special case. And of course, you have to be familiar with a sphere, not to identify everything what might be or what might cause uneasy as such a drift into the ultimate, which human beings shouldn't do. Of course, there you have to be cautious. But nevertheless, the differentiation in general gives you this this, hopefully, competence, and therefore the idea of the ultimate enforces, corrects, and set limitations for the penultimate, or in a more subjective manner, we called the same idea, the belief in the ultimate enforces, corrects, and set limitations for the perspectives on the penultimate. So that is only a formulation which is only used within the human sphere, subjectivity driven, while the first, without the brackets, is a more driven formulation within the realm of a theology of revelation. So, this differentiation I combine with another idea of which I like very much, of Karl Barth, and he introduced in his voluminous work of the Church Dogmatics, 12,000 pages long, and it's still a fragment, the differentiation between three forms of, in theological terms, we call it sin. Of course, as I mentioned, I look for bilinguality, and therefore my invitation for all of those who do not believe in all this stuff is, I think most people have the feeling that there is a radical incoherence with one's own essential vocations and gifts. I think this experience most people share, that we do not live a perfect life, but fail with regard to our ideas, our vocations, our communications, our relations, always and ever. And we need a need for reconciliation. But I hope that most of you, if you believe or not, could share this presupposition. If, then Barth differentiates three forms of this radical incoherence with one's own essential vocations. The first, in theological terms, pride and fall of man, sloth and misery of man. Secondly, and falsehood and condemnation of man. Reinterpreted in a non-theological term, one could say that, I have to go to I look for my most important slide, yeah. One could say pride and fall of man means notoriously man overestimates his own abilities and never acts in a way as if he had all these abilities. Sloth and misery means steadily you underperform in some ways, so you do not really fulfill all your gifts you have. And thirdly, there's a constant inconsistency between your aspirations and the reality. And having this in mind, and picking up again the differentiation between the ultimate and the penultimate, one could say, when it comes to pride and fall of man, then you could identify this radical improperness in dealing with emerging biotechnologies in a way that penultimate is allegedly accomplishing ultimate. So these are the pseudo-religious claims of biotechnologies to solve societal and anthropological problems and conflicts. This is what we often learn. Think about what Craig Venter said when he introduced his forms of his new bacteria forms of synthetic biology. He said, now we took over the job of God. Not playing God, we were, in some special sense, God. Secondly, sloth and misery of man, claiming allegedly ultimate as inadequate frontier of existing penultimate. That is what I call the protest communication form. So discrediting all kinds of scientific progress as a sort of hubris. And falsehood and condemnation in the field of biotechnologies means, on the one hand, on the side of the scientists claiming they would play God via science, and on the other hand, also from the general public denouncing scientists as playing God, which normally they don't, and they do not claim to do. And then I also provide some of overcoming ideas or some ideas to overcome these pitfalls and shortcomings. For example, that science should consolidate in society, recognize that research is an intrinsic value for and a gift for human life form. Accordingly, expectations should be appropriate detourings, some poor outcomes, and complexity should in general be recognized as ordinary side effect of good scientific practice. Normally, general public expects that science always produce results in a way that they have an impact on medicine, of environmental problems, and so on. No, that is not science. Yeah? And we should recognize that only if we recognize it, also in terms of financing, funding it, then we refrain from these over-expectations into science. And with regard to sloth, taking the vocation of responsibly seriously, or establishing a culture of responsibility within the scientific community, several codes of conducts have been set up in the last years in order to build up sensitivity within the community of scientists for their work, having in mind their work, and also within the general public establishing a thorough education in science, democracy, and media usage against all these claims of fake news. And via the difference between competence and ambiguity tolerance, I would propose true transparency, which means always reflecting on the limits of transparency and participation, responsible research and innovation, public engagement with society, citizen science, and publicly run media. Look at Switzerland in the next week, or at least a media system which well-informed journalists with regard to science will still hold on. So these are ideas I would propose in order not on the one hand run into the pitfall of protest communication and also not run into the a pitfall of raising acceptance, but in order to keep a happy medium way of responsibility with regard to the gift of curiosity we as humans, as man created in the image of God, have in order to shape responsibly our world, and which we as scholars, as ethicists, as churches should with solidarity accompany. So thank you for your attention.